Northern Australia's economic potential must be harnessed, according to the government, which has released a green paper today outlining more details about the plan to actually unleash that economic potential. This green paper today, released this afternoon, seems to explore the establishment of special economic zones, also zones really north of the Tropic of Capricorn. The paper does seem to outline 6 main focus areas and involves changes to Indigenous land tenure and the potential for using foreign aid to encourage students from developing countries to study in northern universities. The paper seems to revive the hope of developing the food bowl in the north to boost Australia's agricultural production. However, it must be pointed out this is one of many reports and task forces to be announced. So for some reaction, we head live to our Northern Territory reporter Dan Borscher, currently in Tennant Creek, and having gone through as much detail as you can of that green paper in the short amount of time since it's been released. Thank you so much, Dan. What do you notice on first glance about this green paper and what it's saying about the plan for Northern Australia today?
Good afternoon. Well, you'd have to say it's an extensive document, more than 200 pages of what the governments really hope will be their outline for how to develop the Northern Territory, the northern parts of Western Australia and Queensland. One of the big things that does jump out is just the reliance that will be put onto the private sector in order to see this happen. And of course, you mentioned there in your introduction about this special economic zone. This was an idea that's been around, some might say, for decades, was refloated by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in the lead up to last year's election. When he was in Darwin, he said there needed to be a lower tax threshold in the Northern Territory and Northern Australia in a bid to ensure that international and domestic companies can set up their bases in the north and use that as a base. So really an opportunity, he was suggesting, to kickstart more business growth in the region. The question, of course, on that matter is just how that'll be acted upon. So how can it work? There have been failed examples in the past of economic trade zones. So the big question, of course, will be on government of how to make that work effectively.
There's been parliamentary committee hearings of evidence in the top end really since February or so. I know you've sat and covered some of those hearings into the issue. What are the priorities, or maybe as you've been listening to the debate unfold, what are some of the more contentious aspects perhaps?
I think some of the priorities would have to be around spending. We saw a big focus on the hearings that were held in Darwin about a lack of investment and a lack of insight by the federal and territory governments into the way that infrastructure is developed in the Northern Territory. We saw the Chief Minister, Adam Giles, saying that to develop 1 kilometre of road in the Northern Territory alone costs around $750,000, whereas elsewhere in the country it costs $250,000. So he conceded that there are higher costs for gravel and associated services up north. However, to think that it's 3 times the price of what it would be elsewhere in the country, you'd have to say is a really serious difference. We did also hear that there were some comments that the Northern Territory has received just $500 million of infrastructure spend out of the $126 billion allocated in the recent federal budget right across the country to infrastructure. So for somewhere where you'd expect there to be a big focus, such a little spend. Yeah,
and it does feel like you hear a lot about this kind of thing in, say, an election campaign, but now we're into the new government. I don't probably feel like we've heard a lot about it. And I suppose, you know, in Sydney or in Melbourne or in Canberra sipping lattes, fascinating to think about the potential of those up north. What about how the debates actually go down with those people in the north?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's 2 interesting things there. The first is the reaction here. The idea of a northern food bowl, of course, as you know, is something that has been around for decades. This is not a new concept. And of course, everyone in the Northern Territory, the north of Western Australia and northern Queensland would love this to happen. It would mean a major output of agriculture and an input of money and resources coming into this stretch of Northern Australia. However, the problem is that every time that this debate stirs around and is then dropped when it becomes politically unviable, it significantly damages the goodwill that people have towards the interstate to the southern capitals about ways to develop the north. So I think that there will be a view of scepticism about today's Green Paper, and that's probably rightly so, as there's been decades and decades of discussions about this. The challenge now for this panel that's been announced by the acting Prime Minister, which is headed up by the former Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, Shane Stone, will be to bring Territorians and those living across the board in Northern Australia on board. These are big picture items that could effectively change the way that the economy is driven in this country for decades to come, particularly when you consider that some 40% of the world's middle class are going to be living in proximity to Northern Australia in the decades to come. So certainly a significant time, and I know that the government's been really pushing the August deadline for submissions, and you'd have to think, Brooke, that there will be hundreds, if not thousands of submissions on how to effectively move the North forward in the years to come.
And as you said, to get people on board such a long-term plan, that's always going to be the challenge in politics, isn't it? Thank you so much, Dan Borsche, for joining us and for explaining it all to us.